the Soviet Union, summer 1943. Two generals go head-to-head in an epic battle that will determine the fate of Eastern Europe. The Germans are led by a blue-blooded Prussian. Opposing him is a peasant-born son of the Russian Revolution. They may be kilometers apart, but in their minds, the generals stand over the same table. Two modern-day military specialists will get inside their heads to unpick their tactics and strategy. A team of experts will weigh up their hardware and firepower to reveal just how the greatest tank battle of all time was won. February 1943. The German army has just suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. It is the Third Reich's first major setback of the war. The Russians had cleverly drawn the Germans into the city, a battleground that favored the Red Army with its mastery of close-quarter fighting. The German army loses some 200,000 men. It has to pull back to lick its wounds. The battlefront is redrawn along the 1,500 kilometers between Leningrad and the Black Sea. Hitler demands revenge. He hands the job of masterminding a new offensive to the most brilliant German tactician of the war, 55-year-old Field Marshal Erich von Manstein.
Von Manstein stands out absolutely head and shoulders above almost any other German general fielded. He is undoubtedly one of the finest operational level commanders you could find in history.
Major General Simon Mayle, a distinguished commander in both Gulf Wars, believes von Manstein was destined to become a great general.
Von Manstein comes from a very traditional Prussian family. Soldiering's in his blood. His family motto is steadfast in loyalty. So he arrives in the army with a very strong sense of duty, a great strong sense of obedience, a great strong sense of Germanic history, and a strong sense of loyalty to the state and loyalty and obedience to superior officers.
Across the planning table from von Manstein is his adversary, 46-year-old Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Red Army, with the fearsome reputation of being one of the few men who can say no to Stalin.
Zhukov is from a poor background, a peasant background. He joins as a private, the Red Army during the Revolution, so he works his way up through the ranks. This is a very, very different background to that we see for his German counterpart.
Military historian Professor Philip Sabin has closely studied Zhukov's war.
Zhukov was a very much general in the Soviet mold. He's willing to expend lives. You don't want to cross him. You don't want to disobey him, otherwise you really are in fear of your life. He is willing to get things done and to push things through, whatever the cost. And I think Stalin respected that.
The stark contrast in background and temperament of these two generals has an immense impact on the unfolding battle. Zhukov would like nothing better than to draw Manstein into close-quarter combat once again. But Manstein is determined to fight the Red Army in open country. His battleground will be the large bulge in the front line, separating the Germans in the west from the Russians in the east. This is an area of land half the size of England. Von Manstein will lead Army Group South, a force of 300,000 men, into the bulge from below. Meanwhile, Army Group Center will tear into the bulge from above. These two pincers will meet at the city of Kursk to enclose hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers and allow the Germans to annihilate them at their leisure. Hitler believes they can achieve victory through superior technology. His engineers have been working hard to improve what is already one of the most fearsome weapons in the German arsenal. A powerful gun designed to shoot down aircraft.
The 88 flat gun started life as an anti-aircraft gun because it could sling a 21-pound shell at 840 meters per second. However, the German generals realized that if you lowered the gun and you aimed straight down it, you could take out enemy tanks at well over 2,000 meters.
But moving the 88 into position on a battlefield isn't easy.
This gun is a 7-ton monster. It needs a big truck to pull it anywhere. And once that truck disengages and clears off, the crew are left here on their own, waiting at the beck and call of that big truck.
And then it takes time to prepare the 88 gun for action.
Every time you stop this gun, you've got to bring down the stabilizers and then getting the fire control into position ready to fire accurately at the enemy. And that all takes a lot of time. They're totally vulnerable to any enemy attack. So it weighs over 7 tons and it's got absolutely no protection. Well, German designers came up with the solution. They decided to pack this amazing gun into a turret, surround the crew for protection with up to 10-centimeter thick armor plating, and then for mobility, put tracks and a huge engine on it, turning this super gun into a super tank, known as the Mark 6, but better known to you and me as the Tiger.
The Tiger can fire further than any Soviet tank, and its thick armor makes it practically impenetrable to enemy shells. By putting the most feared gun of the Second World War onto a tank, the Germans believe they have a world beater. But the Russians are quietly confident that they have something that will neutralize the high-tech Tiger. The humble shovel. Hitler is so enamored with his new wonder weapons like the Tiger tank that he orders von Manstein to hold back launching the offensive towards Kursk until enough of them have been delivered to the front line. This will delay the attack for 3 months, going completely against von Manstein's military instinct. He is master of blitzkrieg, a tactic invented by the Germans in response to the fatal stalemate that characterized trench warfare in World War I, when opposing armies would send wave after wave of their soldiers onto the battlefield and into a hail of machine gun bullets. Blitzkrieg replaces men with machines. Massive air power and fast tanks attack with lightning speed to catch the enemy off guard. Quick-witted officers coordinate these attacks, concentrating their firepower on weak spots in the enemy's lines.
All their best commanders were imbued with the idea of moving fast, attacking the enemy's flanks, getting behind him, breaking up his cohesion. You've got to hold him by the nose while kicking him in the backside.
Von Manstein knows that delaying the date of attack might ruin any chance of surprising the enemy. But Hitler is adamant. Von Manstein will have to wait for the new tanks to arrive.
I think von Manstein would have been utterly frustrated. Manstein would definitely have worked on the principle that where the Germans were at their most effective was seizing the opportunity and getting into, as quickly as possible, into a free-flowing battle. On the other hand, of course, you have Hitler, who's obsessed with planning. There's a certain amount of loathing of taking decisions. Hitler hated, to an extent, taking decisions. And so the months begin to go by.
Despite his outstanding military record, von Manstein never manages to command Hitler's full respect. Their relationship is fundamentally tainted by Manstein's aristocratic upbringing.
Manstein had very little time for Hitler as a man, and Hitler never totally believed that the to use shorthand really, the Prussian officer corps could really be trusted to carry through the political agenda of Nazism.
On the Russian side of the planning table, master and commander are also divided. Here, Stalin insists that they attack the Germans straight away, but Zhukov wants to wait.
The options for the Soviets in the spring of 1943 are either to attack or to defend. They now have a stabilized front line. Should they push on, or should they wait for the Germans to attack them? Stalin very much is inclined towards attack. Essentially, his solution throughout from 1941 had been, when in doubt, attack, put pressure on the Germans, kill Germans, retake Soviet territory, much of which is still occupied by the Germans. Zhukov is a cautious man who wants to get all his ducks in a row first. Let the Germans attack, wear them down, and then succeed in the counterattack. So he very much is in favor of waiting, letting the Germans attack, and then striking back.
We sought to meet the expected German offensive with a powerful defense, bleed the enemy white, and then launch a counter-offensive and completely defeat him.
Zhukov argues that instead of attacking straight away, they should build a defensive buffer to put the brakes on the blitzkrieg juggernaut. He knows that in a war of attrition, it is numbers that count, and his side outnumbers the Germans in both men and machines. If they can force von Manstein into a static slogging match, he is confident that the Russians will have the upper hand. Zhukov wins Stalin round. He orders the Red Army, together with 300,000 civilians, to prepare the biggest defensive works ever seen.
Kursk is a massive battlefield. The sheer scale of this is enormous, hundreds of kilometers, and it's largely open steppe. This is ideal country for armored operations, and sadly that's what the Germans have historically been best at. What he wants instead is to bog the Germans down in fixed defenses, hundreds of kilometers deep with multiple defense lines.
Zhukov knows the simplest way to stop a charging tank is to dig a ditch in front of it. Our trench is 1/6 scale, but the principle is exactly the same. An immobilizing drop on one side and an insurmountable barricade on the other.
Battle of Kursk, from a tank commander's point of view, is an absolute nightmare. They had anti-tank ditches, dug-in infantry. They had obstacles everywhere along the axis of advance. So what would happen if a tank was advancing towards a ditch like this? He's stuck in the trench. Can he reverse himself out? Okay. Trench 1, Tiger 0.
Royal Engineer Captain Robert Stork has encountered anti-tank ditches himself in Iraq. He knows they are more than straightforward tank traps.
An anti-tank ditch is designed not only to try and capture and trap the enemy armoured vehicles, but also to try and move the enemy where you want him to go.
Clever positioning of anti-tank ditches forces the tank to follow a particular route.
What we're trying to do is actually not just stop the tank, but make them go where we want them to actually go, into a killing area, so the commanders can then concentrate their force, their artillery, into that area to kill as many enemies as possible.
But these ditches are just part of Zhukov's plan. They're designed to slow down the German advance, and while their tanks are held up, they can be picked off by Russian artillery. These clusters of anti-tank guns and obstacles are laid out like a checkerboard and connected by trenches to form a defensive belt, some 6 kilometers deep in places. Each kilometer of belt contains as many as 4,500 men, 45 tanks, and 100 guns. There are 8 of these defensive bands stretching back almost 200 kilometers into Russia. Zhukov is transforming the open country, so perfect for von Manstein's lightning blitzkrieg attack, into a dense web of traps to entangle the approaching enemy. In preparation for his main offensive, von Manstein sends in reconnaissance aircraft to seek out Russian artillery positions. And then he sends in his Stukas to bomb them. From the air, the Russian positions appear easy targets. But Zhukov, alert to the threat, has a trick up his sleeve.
What the Russians are trying to achieve here is deceiving the Luftwaffe, who are in the reconnaissance aircraft flying over these positions, that this is the strong point, by first of all cutting through the grass to imitate the tracks where the wheels would have left marks on the ground. We've marked at the front where the muzzle blast would have burnt the ground, and also we've tried to replicate a gun position itself with a barrel and the legs coming off at an angle, again deceiving the enemy that this is a defended position.
The Soviets are very, very good at deception. They call it maskirovka. They can hide these forces by day from German reconnaissance. They can make sure that their deployments are concealed, such that when they eventually attack, it does come as a major surprise.
Zhukov is confident that the Germans do not know the full extent of what they are up against. In the early hours of the 5th of July, Hitler finally allows von Manstein to attack. Hitler sends his men into battle with a grave message.
This day, you are to take part in an offensive of such importance that the whole future of the war may depend on its outcome.
The greatest concentration of German tanks and assault guns ever employed storm across the Russian steppe, from the north and south, in a pincer movement. But the attack is immediately slowed down by Zhukov's lethal obstacle course. Scattered throughout the defences are these, the scourge of every tank driver, anti-tank mines.
So, let us place it under this representative vehicle.
Explosives engineer Dr. Sidney Alford has to make do with a clapped-out car for his demonstration of an anti-tank mine.
Firing! I cannot deny this is not really a tank, but it was a working vehicle before we pressed a button. You can see that it has separated main components, it's shredded the body, it's dispersed the body. There's body 50 meters over there, there's body over there, there's body over here, and there is the steering section over here. Here we have an unusually neat crater, that's beautiful, but that will give you some idea of the power of mines. No one, of course, would have survived in a vehicle like that. If they were in a tank and it was only one tread that touched the mine, with luck, some people inside may have survived a bang. They would probably have died as a result of being immobilized, and the concussion could well have killed them.
Even as the German tanks advance, the Russians lay more mines in their path. Over the entire Kursk bulge, the Red Army lays 40,000 mines. In some places, they are just 30 centimeters apart. It's hardly surprising that von Manstein is finding that his advance isn't as easy as he had hoped.
Tanks in minefields, infantry in minefields, are under quite severe psychological pressure. Having been through a minefield myself, you know that if the enemy has laid his minefields out, well, you are going to get caught. Some of you are going to get caught on minefields. They are absolutely designed to slow you down, break you up, create battlefield debris, and set you up to be taken out by other elements of the defensive force.
Von Manstein's engineers attempt to clear lanes through the minefields. But clearing mines by hand takes time and costs lives. And von Manstein simply doesn't have the men to lose. So he turns to technology, a bomb on tracks called a Goliath. A combat engineer steers the Goliath by remote control into the minefield and then detonates it. The force of the explosion causing the buried mines all around to blow up. The Russians try to stop the march of the Goliath with their rifles, but the Germans steadily carve their way through the minefields. Von Manstein arranges his 700 tanks into wedge-shaped formations to charge through the gaps he has blown open in the minefields.
He goes for wedges, where he tries to put the tip of the spear, not simply tanks, but the most heavily armoured tanks, because he is hoping that they will be heavy enough, and supported by engineers, to break through. And behind him, he has this wedge of Panthers and then the rather older Mark IIIs and IVs. And he hopes to push enough through that he will overwhelm the defences.
Von Manstein's tanks burst through the Russian lines. But in the north, the second German pincer does not lead with tanks, and the Russians prevail.
In the north of the salient, the Soviet defensive tactics worked very well. The Germans attacked with infantry in the lead, hoping that they would keep the panzers ready for a breakthrough, which actually never took place. Very soon, a stalemate was reached, so very quickly the northern attack had effectively to be called off. In the south, the force balance was rather different. The Germans had more tanks. They attacked with their tanks in the lead and took the hits that entailed. And so the Germans were able to make a rather greater penetration.
By the end of the first day, von Manstein's tanks in the south have smashed through the first Russian line of defense and advanced about 10 kilometers.
Von Manstein's plan did need both pincers to succeed, and he'd be more and more aware that the great plan of the encirclement was not going to be achieved. Can he still, with a single pincer driving up from the south, unsettle the Soviet defensive plan and get in among the Soviet strategic reserves and give them such a hammering that they're not in a position to go onto the offensive in 43?
Von Manstein's mission has suddenly become even harder. With the pincer movement in the north floundering, von Manstein has to call upon all his strategizing prowess to keep the pressure on the Russians. He darts forward in sudden night attacks, taking the enemy by surprise. He even sends sorties behind enemy lines to sow panic and confusion. On one occasion, the Germans commandeer some Russian tanks and move deep into Soviet territory. When they meet a genuine Russian tank column, they seize the chance to exploit a weakness they discovered earlier in the war. Only the command tank in a Russian column can transmit radio messages. Knock this one out, and the other tanks can't communicate to coordinate their next move. Some German tanks destroy as many as 18 Russian tanks in a day, but the Soviet factories are able to replace the lost tanks with ease. The Germans are not equipped for such a slogging match.
From von Manstein's point of view, an attrition battle, fighting tanks through a really difficult minefield area up against superior number of tanks, massed artillery coming down, is just not the battle they really want to fight. So Manstein knows that he and his commanders, if they're going to have any hope of success, have got to keep grinding away until they break through this hard outer crust of the Russian defenses. If they can do it, they're back into the type of battle that they are all absolutely brilliant at, the maneuver battle using the blitzkrieg tactics.
Von Manstein loses patience with chipping away at the crust. He decides to abandon the direct approach to Kursk and go round the Red Army's main defenses. This route will take him through the town of Prokhorovka into the Russian heartland. For Zhukov, this is too close for comfort.
I think the crisis point of the battle for the Soviets comes when their first few defense lines in the south, the main defense lines, have been penetrated, that the Germans are 35, 40 kilometers into their lines. Zhukov knows, however, that The Soviet forces compared to them are stronger, not only in terms of quantity, not only in terms of numbers of men and tanks, but also in terms of the morale they've gained from the victory at Stalingrad. So he knows that it's not going to be in any way an easy fight, but he still thinks that if the battle is shaped according to his perceptions, he can win.
Von Manstein's deep incursion forces Zhukov's hand. Behind the Kursk bulge, waiting to be summoned, he has an entire army of reserves. The steppe front, 400,000 men strong. Zhukov's dilemma is when to release these reinforcements. Timing is crucial. Zhukov needs to be sure the Germans are sufficiently weakened after 7 days of fighting for his reserve forces to beat them. If not, and the reserves are sent in too soon, the Germans could simply overpower them.
The main role of the steppe front was to launch the counter-offensive, the major counter-offensive that Zhukov had been planning once the initial German attack had been absorbed. But now it looked as though the Germans might actually be breaking through. That became perilous, because you really did need to stop the Germans. The fateful decision was therefore made to actually release the steppe front reserves.
The reserves represent the Russians' last line of defense. If the Germans break through, the road is clear all the way to Kursk. On the morning of the 12th of July, Zhukov's steppe front tanks meet head-to-head with von Manstein's tanks near the town of Prokhorovka. This is the start of the single largest tank engagement in the history of warfare. Squaring up to the 56-ton German Tiger is the Russian featherweight, the 31-ton T-34.
The T-34, it was easy to make, easy to maintain, and could be driven by practically anyone, and quite often was. In some cases, they drove it straight off the production line and straight into battle. They didn't modify it, really, throughout the war, which meant they could keep churning them out, and churn them out they did.
One of the key design considerations was how to protect the tank, but not weigh it down with so much heavy armor that it loses speed and agility. The solution is simple, but ingenious.
The Tiger's armor plate on the front was 100 millimeters thick. Now on the T-34, it was only 60 millimeters thick. But unlike the vertical armor on the Tiger, on the T-34, it sloped. One of the advantages of sloped armor is that some anti-tank rounds simply glance off. But what if an anti-tank round actually penetrates the sloped armor? How does that compare with vertical armor?
We're about to find out, using two identical copies of a very thick book and an air rifle.
Now for our second round. Okay, so let's see how far the bullet got through on our vertical armor equivalent. 240, 200, it's penetrated to 248, 250. Now let's see our sloped armor equivalent. Okay, that's only gone to 111.
The tank designers found that sloping the armor increases the amount of steel a round has to travel through. An angle of 60 degrees doubles the effective thickness of the armor without increasing the weight. Less weight gives the T-34 tank more speed, which Zhukov immediately exploits. Zhukov turns the blitzkrieg tactic back upon von Manstein, launching a fast, concentrated attack. Von Manstein is hoping to pick off the T-34s with his Tiger tank's long-range guns. But Zhukov doesn't give him the opportunity to fight at a distance. Instead, he sends his T-34s in close to swarm among the Tigers and fire at point-blank range.
The big advantage of the Soviet T-34s is there's so many of them that they can literally charge through with committed crews. They can take their losses and get to close quarters, get to the flanks and rear of the German tanks, where even the T-34's 76mm gun is easily able to penetrate. The forces are actually intermingled before they know it. It's exactly the kind of battle that the Germans didn't really want to fight, because their tanks are best equipped to stand off at long range and pick off the Soviet tanks before the Soviets can even do anything. Instead, they find themselves cheek by jowl with the Soviets, engaging in this very close-range tactical maneuvering.
The battle degenerates into a gruesome slogging match. This is not going according to von Manstein's plans.
What he's hoping to do, of course, is hit a Soviet organization that's either on the back foot or static to achieve shock action, breakthrough. At the same time, the Russians are trying to use their tanks in a similar manner, in a cavalry charge. And what you get, of course, around Prokhorovka is this great cavalry melee. And it's almost impossible to really visualize. The wheat field's on fire, with tanks exploding, turrets flying off, tank crew bailing out, the infantry disorientated. Absolute chaos inside the tank. There'd be cordite, there'd be fear, there'd be sweat, there'd be blood, there'd be the sight and sound of your fellow tank crewmen being blown up in other tanks. There'd be cries coming over your ear sets. The thing is, it is just a gargantuan, and it is the greatest, largest single tank battle in history. It is almost impossible to imagine fighting one like that again.
Any clever strategizing and pre-planning is totally discarded. Now Zhukov and von Manstein can only stand back and watch as it becomes every man for himself, caught up in an almost medieval scene of pure violence. This is no gentlemanly standoff at long distance. Every weapon is fired from point-blank range, and every fight is hand-to-hand. At such close quarters, even the Tiger tank with its impenetrable armor is vulnerable to attack. It could even be knocked out by a humble infantryman armed with a vodka bottle. The Molotov cocktail, in its basic form, is a burning rag in a bottle of petrol that explodes on impact. Explosives engineer Sidney Alford will demonstrate its power. The Russian tank hunters at Kursk have a more sophisticated version of the Molotov cocktail, one that doesn't take vital time to light in the heat of battle. Instead, it relies on a chemical reaction.
I have a bottle of petrol, which is thickened slightly with some rubber. There's also a layer of sulfuric acid. I just taped to the surface a little packet of a substance which ignites and burns quite vigorously in contact with sulfuric acid.
The Russians aim their Molotov cocktails at the air vents leading into the tank's engine compartment. When the bottle smashes, the two substances meet and react. The hot petrol in the tank's engine easily catches fire, making this a simple but highly effective weapon.
That will be getting quite hot inside already, and if it had more fuel in and oil in than that thing has, it would not be a nice place to be. And if it were a tank, it would almost certainly have blown up by now because of its ammunition. I'm about 5 or 6 meters away, but it's getting rather uncomfortably warm. I think I'll evacuate.
The crew of a Tiger tank has little chance to evacuate, and even if they do manage to escape, they can be picked off by enemy infantry. But it's not just tank crews and foot soldiers that fight at close quarters. Pilots from both sides discover if they fly low enough, they can drop their bombs right on the tank's most vulnerable spot, on top, where its armor is thinnest. But at this low altitude, the planes are easy targets for anti-aircraft guns. The Russian pilots are surprisingly confident. Their aircraft is the T-34 of the skies, the Sturmovik. Nicknamed the Flying Tank, this heavily armored plane is still light enough to be agile. The secret of its success lies beneath its skin. To save weight, the armor is built into the airframe, rather than being added later to the finished plane. A lighter aircraft can carry more weapons and fuel. The armor is so effective, the plane can withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft shells. Cocooned in their flying tanks, the Russian pilots bravely press home their low-level attacks.
They put enough armour in the Sturmovik that it could resist a certain degree of small arms fire, and that emboldened the aircrew and made them more willing to come in, to stay over the battlefield, and then to be able to launch attacks on targets that they could find.
The Battle of Kursk has been raging for 7 days, and the landscape has become a living hell, as one of Zhukov's men observes.
Dead bodies, destroyed tanks, crushed guns, and numerous shell craters dotted the battlefield. There was not a single blade of grass to be seen, only burnt, black, and smouldering earth throughout the entire depth of our attack.
But amongst this carnage, it's hard to tell which side is emerging victorious. The evening of July 12th, 1943. Russian and German forces have been locked in grim combat for a week. The titanic clash of tanks at Prokhorovka is taking a huge toll on both men and machines.
The armies fall back a bit to lick their wounds, and people assume that they're going to take this up the next day and move on forward. And there's a feeling, probably on both sides, that they've got the better of the encounter, and then waiting to see what the next day is going to bring.
Although the German forces are totally exhausted, von Manstein remains determined, gearing them up for the next onslaught.
His belief, and it's unlike him to want to keep stuck in an attritional battle, is that one last heave could get them through to the country beyond.
Then Hitler delivers some news that scuppers von Manstein's plans. The Allies have invaded Sicily, and Italy is in danger of being lost. Hitler wants to withdraw tanks from Kursk and send them west to reinforce Italy, over 2,000 kilometers away. Von Manstein is devastated.
To his horror, Hitler begins to lose interest in the Eastern Front, begins to draw off, instead of reinforcing Manstein, begins to draw elements off. Manstein just knows that the initiative has been passed to the Soviets. Manstein argues for a continued offensive. In his true Prussian tradition, he'd have been fairly forceful, but polite.
Von Manstein negotiates a compromise. Hitler allows him to continue his attacks in the south to inflict at least a partial defeat on the Russians. But the Russians have other ideas.
Remember the bigger picture. It's not just Sicily. It's not just the withdrawal of German forces to try to counter what the Allies are doing in the West. It's also that the Soviets are launching massive counteroffensives themselves. They're launching one towards Orel, to the north of the Bulge. They're launching one down by the Black Sea on the Mius River. The Germans have to withdraw forces from the Kursk attack in order to protect themselves against the Soviets elsewhere on the front.
Fighting between the exhausted troops continues for several days, but on July 17th, Hitler orders the 2nd Panzer Corps, which has borne the brunt of the fighting at Prokhorovka, out of the line. The battle is over. Within days, the Soviets recover all the ground they have lost to the Germans. The victorious Red Army have lost almost 180,000 men in 2 weeks, missing, wounded, or dead. The defeated Germans lose less than a third of that. 50,000 are killed or injured.
Both sides suffer tremendous losses. The Soviets lose more, but then, as is the case throughout Kursk and indeed throughout the Eastern Front, they can afford to take the losses and the Germans can't.
Zhukov relishes his victory.
The Germans are now compelled to taste the bitter cup of crippling defeat, and to feel the might of the Soviet arms, which the people had made to crush a strong and much hated enemy.
Zhukov is a great general for his circumstances. He's exactly the general that the Soviets need. He is ruthless, he is willing to launch attacks regardless of cost, even if some of them fail, to use superior resources to overwhelm an enemy in a battle of attrition. That's the way the Soviets effectively win and defeat the Germans. He's not as good a general in terms of clever maneuvers as someone like Manstein. He doesn't win cheap victories. In pretty much all of his battles, he loses more men than the enemy does. But he has more men to spare.
I still believe, because of the delay, that it becomes a Soviet victory. Because the Soviets have, they are the ones who've now shaped the battlefield with the delay. They're the ones who've decided that it's the Germans who will go onto the offensive. They will go onto the strategic defensive. They will then use Kursk as the lure, the bait, the operational theatre in which they will destroy the German capacity for maneuver. So yes, the Germans do lose at Kursk. The question is, could they have won at Kursk, or did actually all they do is conform to a Soviet plan which has them attacking a vastly superior defensive position?
Von Manstein blames the humiliating defeat on Hitler and withdraws from the battlefield a broken man.